Got to hit record, so I'm going to record right now. If you are new to the LibParlor community, welcome. LibParlor is a space for conversing, sharing expertise, and asking questions about the process of developing, pursuing, and publishing library research. We aim to build a community of researchers and strive to share information on how to do research in LIS. We are so excited to be starting our webinar series today. This talk is being recorded, and after the webinar, slides and the recording will be shared on our website, so stay tuned for that. And now I'm going to turn things over to our panel. Again, thanks for being here.
Haley, thank you so much. So this is Melissa, and I'm going to start us off today. First, we want to thank LibParlor for inviting us to speak today. This year, they were recognized by ACRL's University Library section with the year's Outstanding Professional Development Award, which is so well deserved for the work that they're doing. And we're so happy and honored to be the inaugural webinar in this series that they are starting. It's really exciting for us this afternoon. I'm going to start with just a quick introduction to our panel and the experience that we're bringing to our discussion today. So Dan Tracy is the head of scholarly communication and publishing at the University of Illinois Library, which includes iOpen, a university initiative to publish open access scholarly materials, including books, journals, and digital projects. Laura Saunders is an associate professor in the School of Library and Information Science at Simmons University, and I am an adjunct instructor in the School of Information Sciences at the University of Illinois. And Laura and I have both written and edited traditional monographs, and in 2020, we published an open textbook with iOpen and worked with Dan on that whole process. And Becky Graham is an instructional design and technology librarian at Westminster College, and she joins us today as an accessibility expert. And while she was not involved in our particular book, she has extensive experience helping faculty develop open, accessible educational resources. Or I should say both, open and accessible educational resources. So we're going to talk today about the process of publishing open monographs. We have left ample time for questions at the end of our discussion today, but we also welcome you to ask questions as we go along. And if they fit with what we're talking about, we'll pause and answer questions. And then again, also go back and try and catch all of those at the end of our talk. So Laura, if you would give us the next slide. I thought we'd start by just briefly touching on why we would want to publish open, or I think in the case for a lot of us as librarians, we're sometimes encouraging our faculty and our graduate students and our researchers to look at publishing open. And when we think about publishing open access monographs, an open access monograph is a book that's made available to readers free of charge. Typically, these are going to be published on a website where users can read the book online or often download selected chapters or even the entire book. I'm actually going to put in a link to an example for folks who maybe haven't seen this before. And in some cases, open monographs are also made available as a print book. They might be sold for the cost of printing, which is the case with the book that I just linked you to, or they maybe a little bit more to help recoup some of the production costs of publishing a book open access. And on our slide, I provided a couple of additional examples of this. So the cover on the far right is the book that Laura and I published, which is an open textbook that students can read online. They can download a PDF. And we also have a print on demand copy, which we sell just for the cost that covers the actual printing. So it's, I think, $15. The center book, the writing workshop, this is a really interesting example where a faculty member self-published her book. It's sold on Amazon to help recoup some of the costs that she went through to produce it, but you can also just read and download a copy online. And then the book on the left is Knowledge Justice, which is a fantastic new volume on applying critical race theory to library work. And it is also available as a print book for purchase, but they announced that they have an open access version that's on the MIT Press website. And that is actually being supported from a foundation to make that available open access, which is really awesome to see. So there are kind of different ways that these books become available open access. So why open access then, right? And I think if we're all librarians, we probably have already a shared value around open access. But when we publish something open, then it's available to anybody who wants to read it, regardless of their ability to pay. That can create a wider audience for the work that we're publishing or that our researchers are publishing, because access isn't limited by people's ability to purchase a text. Also, if you're thinking about publishing an open textbook, we know that high textbook costs are a huge barrier for students, where they don't purchase the books for class, or maybe they don't take a class because they know that they can't afford the textbooks. So open textbooks really support equitable access to education for all students. And again, that's a huge value for us, right, as librarians and as educators. I also think that when we as librarians work to publish our own materials open access, then we are modeling that process for our faculty and our students and our researchers. It gives us the ability to talk about that process and really say to folks, look, we're publishing open, and it's something that's feasible and valuable and that you should really look at doing. The other thing that's, I think, kind of fun about open books is because they're published online, instead of necessarily just in print, there's a lot of possibilities for new ways of using images or interaction. And I know that Dan is going to talk about that a little bit later in our webinar today. Laura, can you bump us to the next slide? Thanks. So one of the first things you do want to think about if you're interested in publishing open is whether you want to self-publish your title or use an open access publisher. If you go through self-publishing, you do have a lot of control over your own work. The example that I showed earlier with the writing book, that author also published an article about her decision to self-publish her book, which is kind of interesting. It's a kind of a quick, easy read if you want to check it out. I put the citation in the chat. But if you work with an open access publisher, which is what Laura and I decided to do for our book, I see a lot of advantages. The open publishers will have a platform where they can host your book, and so you don't have to worry about where it's going to live and keeping it updated that way. Typically, they're going to provide you access to more formal publishing software like Pressbooks. And in many cases, publishers will help you with things like laying out your book, getting an ISBN assigned, getting a MARC record created. They may also provide editorial support, copy editing, and also do things like making sure that your book gets listed in appropriate OER repositories, and help with some of the marketing to make sure that your audience is aware that your book is out there and available. And so a lot of what we talk about today is going to assume that you might be interested in identifying and working with an open publisher. Okay, next slide, Laura. Thanks. So if you were going to approach a publisher, and even if you're just thinking through your idea on your own, the first step in publishing a monograph is going to be writing a proposal. And so these are things that you want to think through as you develop your idea. And in many cases, you can approach a publisher or an editor with kind of a general idea, an initial idea of what you might be interested in. But if they're interested in working with you or they think your idea has some merit, they are going to ask you to write a more formal proposal. And typically your publisher is going to have a format that they're going to want you to submit that in. But again, you can be thinking about these things on your own ahead of time. And the first thing is to think about your audience. So who are you writing for? Is this a textbook that's aimed at students? Are you writing a monograph that's aimed at your professional peers? Who might those be? Are those early career librarians? Are those experienced professionals? Is this for a lay audience? The broader your audience is, the more intriguing that might be to a publisher, because they want to ensure that there's a wide audience and wide usage for your title. So for instance, with the textbook that Laura and I wrote, our primary audience was graduate students in LIS, but we also felt that the book would be valuable for early career librarians who were looking for a primer on instruction. And so we always try to keep that in mind when we talked with our publisher and also when we did our writing. You're also going to start thinking about the content of your book. And so, here, what topics and subtopics will you address? What approach are you going to be taking? What's kind of your angle? And really, how is that going to be unique? Because you want to write a book that hasn't been written before, that's offering something new to the profession. And so that has to factor into how you think about your content. You'll also want to think about how in depth are you going to go? What's your target length of your eventual book? Keep in mind too that when you're writing a proposal for a publisher, you are often asked to compare your proposed title to others that are out there on the market. And then you take all that and you write a narrative description. Typically, you're going to write a very short one, maybe 100 words. What I've realized in my career is that that initial 100-word book description you write ends up becoming the back cover of your book a year or two down the road. So it's really important to be succinct and accurate and engaging in that really short description. And then typically you explain your idea to the publisher in a longer narrative as well, and you provide a table of contents. And then especially with open, you're going to be thinking about the format of your book. So what's it going to look like? What features will it have? Is it going to be traditional text with mostly text and images? Are you going to do something more innovative with hyperlinking, with images, with some kind of interaction? If you're writing a textbook, we want to think about how we're going to engage students in particular. So what kinds of boxes and activities might we have? Are we going to have glossaries? And then again, what's your final product going to look like? Are you publishing online only? Will you have a PDF for download? Do you want it to be downloadable to e-readers like Kindles? Are you going to do print on demand? And the reason that's important to think about at the early stages of your project is that all of those can require some additional layout work and may impact the way that you use images. And I'll show you an example later where some of the images Laura and I created were full color images, which was great in the online version. But when we went to create the print on demand version, we had to convert them all to be black and white. And so thinking early about your format will be really helpful in the long run. So I'm going to give a couple other cautions for that early planning. And Laura, if you would just give me the next slide. Typically, open monographs are going to be published under a Creative Commons license. And that obviously impacts how people can use their work. So do you want to allow remixing, or are you going to say no derivatives? And one reason to think about that early on is that the type of license you pick can potentially impact where you can list your monograph. So for example, the Open Textbook Library, which is a major OER repository, requires that you allow remixing. It will not list books with a no derivatives license on it. So if something like that's really important to you or to the faculty member that you're working with, you'll want to check out the repositories that you're considering and what their licensing are and take that into consideration. The other big thing to think about is images. And Laura, if you would just give me one more slide. Thanks. This is a great example of a full color image that we really liked. It was fine online. And then when we went to the print on demand, we had to convert it to black and white. And suddenly that became a lot harder than we thought, because if you take this image and you convert it to grayscale, there's not enough contrast, the green faded out. And so we ended up having to remake some of our images from scratch. And it turned out even that was a little harder than we anticipated. In one case, we had some screenshots from an online catalog that the university had ceased using. And so it wasn't possible to recreate quite the same screenshots again. In this case, we had created this word cloud using climate change as an example, using an online word cloud maker, but it was really hard to get it to remake the exact same word cloud in grayscale with all the bubbles in the same place again. And so again, we kind of learned our lesson that we should have put a lot more thought into how those images were going to perform down the road 8 months later in the production process. So those are just a couple of cautions, the copyright and the images, that I found are really important to think about early in your process instead of at the end. And I think if we go to the next slide, I'm turning it over to you, Laura.
Yes, thank you. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about the planning and writing process. And a lot of this, of course, is based on my personal experience working with Melissa. But I think a lot of our experiences would translate to people who are working on any kind of open access work and across a range of different publishing formats, so self-publishing or working with an open publisher. So to begin with, as Melissa already alluded to, part of what you want to do is just kind of think ahead as to how you want to structure the monograph. And some of this might even have to be addressed, at least to some extent, in the proposal. But one thing is thinking about the target chapter lengths. So you want to think about how long the overall book is going to be, how many chapters there are going to be, and how long each chapter should be. And this is definitely a personal choice to an extent. But one thing that Melissa and I talked about was that because this was essentially an introductory textbook, because we had some experience teaching the course, and so we had a sense of how we liked the flow of the course to go and so on, we had agreed that we wanted relatively short chapters to kind of keep it brisk and provide that introductory overview to all of these different topics, but that could then be supplemented with additional readings. And that worked for our topic and it worked for the purpose of the textbook. But you can think about for other kinds of works, what is going to make sense. It's also important, and I think that Melissa has previewed this as well, to just try to be organized from the start. And I was lucky to be working with Melissa, who is supremely organized and who had worked through this kind of monograph project before. And so she shared a lot of her systems with me. And so one of the things that we did was to just create a spreadsheet where we were able to track everything that we were doing, including we would just listed all of the chapter titles and the target word lengths for the chapters. And then as we finished each draft, we would add in the actual word count for each chapter. And as we revised them, we just tracked everything as we went. And that really helped to keep us organized, as you can imagine. Another thing that we did was to create a folder system, and we chose to use Dropbox. But the important thing is, especially when you're working with a collaborator, is to just find some system that you can use that can be easily shared, where you can have some version control, and where you're able to keep all of your different versions and your different chapters organized. So we started a folder, a root folder in Dropbox, and then we had a folder for each chapter where we were able to keep the chapter document, as well as any additional documents like figures that weren't embedded immediately and things like that. And then we were able to create folder systems for each version of the different chapters. So that gets to files and versions, just making sure that you are tracking everything so that you always know what is the sort of version of record, what's the one that you're working on. And again, this would be important even if you were working alone, but when you're working with a collaborator, part of what we were doing, the way that we approached it, is each of us took the lead on drafting a chapter, and then the other person would read and edit and add suggestions to the chapter. So there were multiple versions going. So it was really important to just make sure that we were tracking those versions and that we knew which version was the last one to have been edited, which one we wanted to work from. So having those folders and those spreadsheets helped to keep us organized in that way. Another thing to think about is a citation style. So what citation style are you going to use for your monograph? And the citation style might also extend to the style guide, which we'll talk about more in a couple of minutes. But the first question to ask is, do you even have a choice? Depending on which publisher you're working with, they may have a citation style that they require you to use, or they may give you some choice. And of course, if you're self-publishing, then it's entirely up to you. So if you do have a choice, the next question to ask yourself is, what do you know well? And I think Melissa would agree with me that it's really important to pick a style that you're already familiar with. As it happens, Melissa and I had actually just finished editing a book that was in Chicago style, and we decided to do this book in APA style for various reasons. And it's challenging. It's challenging when you're going back and forth between a style that you have gotten to know very well and then moving into a new style. So just think about what you know well, because of course you want your citations to be as accurate as possible. And then the last question is just what's going to work well online and perhaps what's going to work best for your audience. So obviously, if you're working with a faculty member who's working in a particular field that tends to use a certain citation style, it makes sense to stick with that because that's probably what their audience will be familiar with. But certain things will work better online or with text that's meant to be read online. So you might just want to think about whether, for instance, parentheticals are going to be, in-text citations are going to be sort of might trip up the reader, or whether endnotes, for instance, can they be linked so that you can go back and forth from the end note back to where you were in the text, or is that going to require a lot of scrolling back and forth and so on. And again, if you're working with a publisher, that's something that they can help you to think through what's going to work with the particular system that you're using. In addition to the citation style, you also want to think about your broader style. So one thing is, what voice and tone do you want to use? And again, as I mentioned, Melissa and I had just finished editing a different textbook where we used a somewhat more formal style and where we asked our chapter authors not to use first person. But with this particular book, again, because of the way we intended to use it, we decided that a first person style would actually be more engaging. But again, that was something that we had to talk through and discuss and kind of decide what made sense for us and for our audience. You may also have to develop a style guide. And again, this will depend to some extent on whether or not you are working with a publisher and whether or not that publisher already has a style guide in place. But if you're self-publishing, or if there isn't a style guide in place, then you want to think about everything else that goes into formatting and tone of your work. So you want to think about how you want the page to be laid out, at least to some extent. Some of that might change as you transfer over to the online system. But you also want to think about things like your heading systems, and you want to think about things like what spellings are you going to use? So we had to think about things like, especially words like ebook or e-learning, whether we were going to use the small e, and again, whether the second letter should be capitalized, and what happens if you're at the beginning of a sentence. We had to think about things like if we were going to hyphenate double adjectives and things like that. So we wanted to make sure that there was consistency across the entire text. And again, this is important even if you're working alone, because you may have a tendency, as I do sometimes, to kind of shift a little bit, especially when you're writing over a long period of time, but certainly when you're working with collaborators, to make sure that there's consistency in the style and voice across the different chapters. So when you are developing a style guide, there's a few things that can be helpful. One is to just think about things like font, headings, and subheadings. Now, one thing that we found is that when we were moving things into Pressbooks actually applied its own style. So some of those choices ahead of time didn't end up being super important. But again, that could vary depending on the system that you're using. So you want to think about font style and size, and Becky's going to talk a little bit more about accessibility. So for now, I'll just leave it at that. But headings and subheadings, whether or not you're going to use numerals or write out number words, thinking about formatting your figures and tables. So for instance, even just thinking about things like, what are we going to call these? Are we going to call them figures? Are we going to call them tables? Are we going to call them, Melissa and I decided to do some activity boxes. And initially we were calling them boxes, but then we decided to call them activities or exercises or things like that. So again, making those decisions up front will save you with some revising and rewriting later on. Thinking about how to deal with lists. For instance, do you want to start each entry in a list with a capital letter? What formats of bullets are you going to use and things like that. So just kind of trying to think about consistency. And as I mentioned, special case words. One thing that Melissa and I did was we highlighted words that had either an unusual spelling that we were afraid that Word might not capture, or things that had diacritical marks, so that we could check those later after we had moved them into Pressbooks and just make sure that they had transferred correctly. It's also important to think about if you're going to use anything that requires permission. So if you're going to use a figure or anything that is somebody else's work, an image, etc. So you want to just be aware of what things need permission, and then think about how you're going to submit requests. And again, if you're working with a publisher, they may have some standard forms or language that you can use. If they don't, it's pretty easy to put something like this together, but just being clear, there's often language you can find online about what you're requesting it for, and how to make sure that you get all of the correct permissions and signatures. And once again, it's helpful to keep organized with this. So we had a spreadsheet for tracking permissions. That didn't actually end up being much of an issue with this particular book, but the previous book that we had written did have more permissions, more copyrighted material that we had to ask permission for. So finding some standard wording for forms and making sure that you have everything that you need so that you don't run into any problems down the line. And now I'm going to just talk really quickly about time management. You know, again, I think this is something that's relatively personal, just figuring out how you're going to make sure that you have time for a big writing project so that you can keep to your deadlines. Because typically, especially if you're working with a publisher, you're probably going to set deadlines both for the publishing date and also maybe interim deadlines for getting a draft manuscript and things like that. So making sure that you're going to be able to meet those. I found it helpful to block out writing time each week and to try and treat that as though it were, you know, my faculty meeting or something like that. So in other words, like it was a real commitment, and I couldn't just say, oh, well, you know, I'll give that up for something else. Also, just being realistic about the amount of time this is going to take and keeping revisions in mind. So getting the first draft done is one thing, but often you're going to go through at least one round, but more likely multiple rounds of revisions. So making sure that you're keeping that timing in mind. And then, as I said, if you're working with collaborators, with Melissa and I, that did, it did require another added layer of time so that we had time to review each other's work and then go over things together that needed to be resolved. It's absolutely worth that extra time because I think we had a much better project in the end, but just being aware of and realistic about that time. And then the last thing that I would say about time management is you just want to be cognizant of the fact that there is a learning curve with the publishing software. And so you want to build a little bit of time for exploring the software into your writing time and into your overall project timeline. Now, again, we worked with iOpen and Pressbooks, and iOpen provided a good level of support, and Pressbooks is not. I didn't find it to be particularly challenging to learn, but there were some quirks. You know, there were things like it turned our first level headers into chapter titles. So we had to go back and revise our headers, and you know, there was no way to know that until we had tried it out. So just taking some time to explore the software. We found that adding tables was a little bit tricky, so we had to take some extra time to figure that out. So just make sure that you give yourself that buffer of time. And then finally, if you're publishing open access, you're probably going to take on at least some of the responsibility for outreach and marketing. And this will be especially true if you're self-publishing entirely on your own. But even for us, we found it helpful to do a little bit of advertising on our own. And so it can be helpful to think ahead of time about who might be interested in your work. And of course, you've already done that probably in your proposal. And so once you've thought about who might be interested, you can reach out to them in different ways. So, and Melissa and I reached out through various, we made announcements to various listservs like the information literacy listserv through ALA and the ACRL frame listserv and things like that. And of course, we promoted it with our social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, etc. But you should also think about things like submitting your work for reviews. That's something that a traditional publisher might do for you. But in this case, we reached out to some publishers, some journals that we thought might be interested in this work, like college and research libraries, and so on. And we just alerted them that the book was coming out, and then we followed up later with a link to the title. And I know so far we've gotten one review, and I'm hopeful that we'll get some more. And then finally, we did a little bit of direct marketing. Because this was meant to be a textbook, since that was the main purpose of the book, we just put together a spreadsheet and did a direct email to the deans or directors of library programs of ALA accredited institutions. And we also sent the same email directly to a few people that we knew taught information literacy or library instruction courses. And I think that actually worked well, because we know that a few people responded to that, and a few people actually adopted the textbook from that direct marketing. So that was definitely worth the time. And I am now going to stop there and turn it over to Becky.
Thank you. So Laura talked about developing that style guide in order to keep your work consistent. Your style guide's actually going to be one of your most important tools for keeping your work accessible as well. And it's really important to design with accessibility in mind from the beginning, rather than trying to remediate things on the back end. When you get it into that publishing software, you're less likely to run into trouble if it was accessible before you got it there. So if we can go to the next slide, we'll take a look at some basic accessibility considerations. To start with, let's make sure we're all on the same page with vocabulary. Universal design is kind of the foundation for accessibility, and it's the idea that whatever you're creating, it should be able to be accessed, understood, used by everyone, regardless of physical or cognitive ability. Within education and librarianship, we tend to talk about UDL, or universal design for learning. And really the big takeaway there is making sure that your reader has multiple means of engagement, providing your data in multiple formats, and then providing kind of a self-guided, self-paced experience. So we can go to the next slide. I like to talk about accessibility as kind of that next step in universal design. It's how do you make all of those multiple means actually usable, and usable for whom? So some of the people that benefit the most from accessible design tend to be people with vision issues, people with hearing issues. That's who we think about the most. But it's also really important for neurodiverse readers, so people with ADHD, autism, dyslexia. And the way you format your text, the way that you chunk it up, can really help with people who have anxiety, OCD, and other mental health issues as well. I could talk forever on all the different ways to make digital and print materials accessible, but we're going to do it very briefly. So here is the link in chat to the WCAG guidelines. That's going to give you an incredible level of detail on every portion of how to make something digitally accessible. But if we go to the next slide, we'll get started on kind of our basics. So Laura talked about heading structure. The accessibility behind heading structure depends on whether it's digital or print, but it's important in either case. For a digital, you want to think about screen reader users, non-visual readers, and without a proper heading structure, they don't have any way to follow your organization. For print, having your text chunked out into headings is going to lower the cognitive load. It also makes it much easier for, even your neurotypical readers to go back and locate a particular piece of information later on without having to scroll through or page through the entire book. So keep your heading structures consistent, and you want to make sure you're actually using the heading 1 style that's provided by your word processor, and not just like indenting or making things bold. Which brings us to the next slide about text styles. So when you're choosing your text, you want to keep a sans serif font. That's going to be a lot easier to read for people with dyslexia specifically, but it is easier for a whole range of visual, people with low vision, have a much easier time with sans serif fonts. You want to limit your font choices down to just like 1 or 2 and make those changes purposeful. You don't want to use a whole range of fonts. It can get really distracting. In terms of font size, it's the same for print and electronic. You don't really want anything smaller than a 12-point font. People who have low vision are not going to be able to see that very well. 14-point is recommended, especially for digital. When it comes to text color, most of your text is probably going to be in black and white, but if you are using color, you need to keep that contrast in mind. And the goal that you're looking for is 4.5 to 1. So you can see the example here. When it's lower than that, it is hard to read even for people with really good vision. It can be nearly impossible for somebody who's colorblind. So on the next slide, we'll talk about some semantic formatting. So this is the difference between your bold and your regular text, when to use italics, those sort of things. From a consistency point of view, you do want to include that in the style guide you make so that you're using it the same way every time. From an accessibility point of view, it does matter whether something is bold or italicized. So for a screen reader user, when the screen reader gets to something that's bold, it will announce that it's bolded. And most screen reader users are used to bold meaning something that is visually emphasized. So there's no difference in the way the screen reader actually reads the word. Italics are different. You would use an italic if it's an auditory emphasis. So if you were to read the sentence out loud and you would say that word differently for emphasis, that's when you want to use italics. And screen reader programs will read that emphasis if you've italicized the word. When it comes to underlining, don't, unless you're doing a link. So for both screen reader users and visual readers, especially in a digital format, we are used to underline text being a link. So if you underline text that isn't a link, it can be very confusing and they might spend some time trying to click something that isn't actually clickable. So keep your underlines just to your hyperlinks. And then on the next slide, we'll talk about some images. So all images need alt text, and alt text is essentially a verbal description of what the image shows and kind of why you chose it. Alt text can be difficult to write because people try and put way too much detail in there, or they don't put enough detail. So my advice for writing alt text is to think about not just what's in the image, but why did you choose it? So in this example, I've got 3 versions of alt text and they're all technically correct. Like this is a nearly empty stadium. This is a stadium that has 2 runners going up the stairs. And this is a stone stadium with some cracks in some of the infrastructure. But why did you choose it? You want someone who reads this, who can't see the image, to understand what its purpose is. So on the next slide, we got to talk about the difference between print and digital. So a lot of people think, well, if I'm only doing something in print, I don't need alt text, right? And the print version would be having a caption underneath your photo. Why would I need that if my reader's obviously someone who's visual, or they wouldn't be reading a print book, right? Well, not necessarily, for one, but also it provides context, which can be really useful for your neurodivergent readers. So somebody who has ADHD or autism might get stuck on your image. And what I mean by that is they might spend time trying to figure out all of those reasons the image might be there. What are they supposed to be focusing on? Is it about that runner at the bottom of the stadium, or is it about the fact that the stadium's built out of stone? On the other hand, they might skip your images altogether and just be very text focused. And so having a captioned version of alt text in a print book resolves both of those issues. It helps your whole range of neurodivergent readers. And you also have to keep in mind that even if you initially print your book and there isn't a digital version, that doesn't mean it's not going to be digitized later. And having those captions builds in the alt text so it doesn't have to be done on the back end. So next slide, please, and we'll continue talking about images. So Melissa mentioned an issue that they had with color contrast, and that is really important to think about and the earlier the better. So not just the contrast between your foreground and background, but the contrast between the items in your image. So in this example, we can see that all the colors are kind of pastel, and there's not enough contrast between the foreground and the background. And even within the data bars themselves, there's not enough contrast between each item. So you can see in the black and white version that you kind of lose that yellow color altogether. And if you are someone who is low vision or severely colorblind, that whole data bar is going to largely fade into itself. So on the next slide, we've got a better example of how to do this, using really strong contrast colors between the fore and background, strong contrast between the data bar, and then incorporating some patterns. So even if you're using colors and someone is colorblind and they can't differentiate that, the pattern gives them that extra level of clarification. So the next thing we're going to talk about on the next slide here is tables. Tables are tricky. And first rule is always use a true table instead of an image of a table. So you want to be able to tab through the table. This is going to be incredibly important for screen reader users, for people who navigate via their keyboard instead of a mouse. And then when you're formatting the table, it needs to have headers on both the rows and columns, and there needs to be a relationship between the rows and columns. So a lot of visual users like to use tables just to organize information, just to make it look nice on the page, but that's very confusing for non-visual readers. So if there's not a direct relationship between your rows and columns, it really shouldn't be a table. It should be a list or some other format. And then when you get your table set, you still need to use alt text or a caption, basically explaining what is in the table, what's the context of the table, and what's the point of this data. So finally, on the last slide here, I just want to provide some tools for checking your accessibility. If you're writing in Google or Microsoft Word, they have built-in accessibility checkers, and they are pretty reliable. If you're working in Adobe, they have an accessibility checker, but they don't give you a lot of information on how to remediate. They just tell you what's wrong with it. I always recommend before you publish, read through with a screen reader so that you can hear what your users are going to hear. And the NVDA screen reader app is free. It's really good. It's easy to learn and navigate with. And then as you're going through, these are two resources that will help you check the color contrast on your images and text. They'll let you know how good the contrast is, and they'll even show you what it will look like to colorblind users. Like I said, there's a whole bunch more we could go through. We could talk about how to make your activities accessible, but these are the basics in terms of formatting your work. And with that, I will turn it over to Danny.
Hi, thanks. So I'm going to talk about publishing workflows and considerations for just the overall publishing process. So I guess we can go ahead and advance the next slide, please. So I want to return first of all to something Melissa was talking about in terms of thinking about working on your own to self-publish versus working with a publisher. I don't want to rehash what she was saying, but you know, these are going to impact the kinds of affordances you have access to, the kind of services you have access to, the ways that you can distribute your work. You know, there are options for both of these, but it's important to keep in mind what your overall goals for the publication and what the needs are for the publication that you want. When both, and this goes both the decision between choosing whether to self-publish versus work with a publisher, but also it applies to if you know you want to work with a publisher, choosing who you want to work with. Digital publishing can vary a lot from publisher to publisher, especially if you move away from more kind of traditional long form books. A lot of the focus so far has been on kind of regular or somewhat traditional books, just kind of in a digital format. But if you move away from that at all, then it really gets variable in terms of what different publishers are going to offer. I will say under publisher here, trade publishers are not going to be quite as relevant for open access publishing generally. University presses and society publishers, some of them may have regular open access book publishing programs. Some of them maybe will do it on an experimental basis or a one-off by request basis. So you will want to kind of look at what your options are. You know, MIT Press is a publisher of one of the books that Melissa was showing earlier, and they've kind of moved into fairly regular open access publishing, at least for many of their titles, and do really great work. On the other side of kind of more digital project type publishing, which I'll talk about more in a bit, Stanford University Press has a digital humanities project publishing program now that is similar to some of what we're doing at iOpen. That is kind of a more university press-based thing. It's a more rare thing to see at a university press. I do also want to give a shout out to library-based publishers, though, not just because iOpen is a library-based publisher, but there may be many other library-based publishers that would be relevant for you to work with depending on your type of project. And the Library Publishing Coalition maintains a directory, the Library Publishing Directory, that they put out every year. And that includes, it's a directory of just all different library publishing programs at different universities and colleges. And what is great about them is that they include lots of information in terms of what that publisher offers and key information. Some library publishers will work with authors only at their own institution. Some library publishers are open to working with external authors as well. So that is obviously an important thing to be aware of, depending on whether the publisher you're looking at is at your institution or not. Different library-based publishers are going to support different platforms for digital publishing. So looking at the platforms and how that fits with the needs of your publication. Different kind of related to the platform question, different publishers will focus on different genre varieties, even in terms of just regular kind of long form book length linear works. There could be varieties of genre focuses. The degree of autonomy and responsibility varies a lot with library-based publishers in terms of how intensely involved they are in the editorial process versus kind of giving you a place to kind of publish your work and doing some of the registration and preservation work for you. Some do more editorial vetting, or if your work is something that needs a peer review process, will run the peer review process for you. Some of them won't. Some of them will help you get things into relevant indexes. Some of them don't do as much of that. So looking at what the service offerings are is important in terms of what your needs are. And then also, again, that question of genre and platform is key. Next slide. So just to pause briefly and say a little bit about the Illinois Open Publishing Network specifically as an example. So as a library-based press, we provide the publishing platforms for people to work with. We have 3 platforms that we support for longer form works. One is Pressbooks, which we've already heard a little bit about and is kind of the most traditional book publishing platform. We support Omeka S, which is a little bit more oriented towards publishing digital exhibits with some long form textual analysis associated with it. And then we provide access to Scalar, which is a little bit more of a hybrid between text and multimedia, where you maybe have an equal balance between those two. Maybe you want to do some more complicated things with multimedia, like annotate the media, or have kind of strange, or you may have kind of different kinds of ways of navigating the text that aren't quite as linear. So it's a little bit more non-traditional in terms of the kind of publication. we provide consultation on using those. We provide some consulting on design options for special genres. We do provide copy editing, and we do something at the same phase as the copy editing called a technical check. That is basically looking at metadata issues and accessibility issues, a lot of the things that Rebecca was talking about, to make sure that we're meeting minimal accessibility requirements. And all of the 3 different platforms have their own pros and cons in terms of their ability to deal with different kinds of accessibility issues successfully. We do register DOIs and ISBNs. We get a record into our local catalog and push that to WorldCat. We do some, but more limited marketing. And we do more recently have added a print on demand option if it is feasible, like which is pretty limited to things that are in Pressbooks and desired for the particular title. And then if it's a long form kind of scholarly work where peer review is needed, we will help facilitate that. The author writes the book, completes the original formatting and layout of the publishing platforms. That's a big kind of addition from kind of more traditional publishing. Helps with the marketing, gets with permissions and does fair use assessment if that is necessary. I think that big piece that is a little bit extra is the actually putting the work in the platform itself and doing a lot of the formatting. And we will consult about best practices. We provide some documentation, but we do ask the authors to do that, in part because for some of our publications, the layout for things in Scalar, there's a lot more specialized relationship between media and text that has to be figured in by the author, and is about authorial choice in a lot of ways, as long as it kind of is kind of within the bounds of what we can do accessibly. Whereas with Pressbooks, it's a little bit more straightforward in terms of the, being a traditional look, at least. Okay, next slide. So as I mentioned, we kind of deal with some kind of non-traditional genres, and these are just a couple of the ones we do. And genres will, for us, often match up with a particular platform and its affordances. So in Pressbooks, Melissa and Laura's book is in Pressbooks. We have another textbook in Pressbooks that uses H5P content. That is a newer feature in Pressbooks, and H5P is a standard. It's basically interactive, like activities and stuff. It's very challenging, and it was a first for us to deal with in this other textbook that we published about the same time as Melissa and Laura's book. And there are a lot of accessibility issues around H5P. Some of the H5P content types are accessible, some of them are not. So we had to go through and check to make sure that the ones that were being used were accessible. And if they weren't, we asked the author to actually tweak some of those choices for that case. They don't really export well into like a PDF. H5P doesn't really, so we had to kind of create alternate options or think about how we wanted to deal with that. You know, if you have Omeka, as I mentioned before, it's kind of more of a digital exhibit kind of platform. It has a lot more affordances for metadata, and it requires a lot more work on metadata than particularly Pressbooks. Scalar could include a similar amount of metadata work, and there's a handful of themes you can choose from. And then, you know, something like Scalar is good for a nonlinear essay with multimedia or embedded visualizations. There are other platforms out there too, and one thing you want to think about as you're choosing a platform is, you know, how does it fit what you're trying to create? Does it have the ability to include the kind of metadata that you need for the kinds of objects that you have if you have media objects? Does it support, how does it support different kinds of accessibility issues? All three of these platforms that we support, for example, do alt text in a totally different way. So we have to provide different guidance on how to implement the alt text to our authors. depending on the platform. You know, what kinds of you know, all of these are some of them are easier to use than others. Pressbooks is pretty straightforward. Others, Scalar takes a little bit more time to get your head around just to even understand the kinds of things you can write successfully in it. So you do want to think about, whenever you're choosing a platform, really think about, what are you trying to create, and is this platform made to do that, or is it really made to do something else, and is there a better platform for you if you have some other options. Next slide. Okay, so to wrap up, things prospective authors should know. First of all, whether you are self-publishing or publishing with a press, it takes time. It's probably going to take, especially if you're a first-time author, or self-publishing for the first time, or working with a press for the first time, regardless, it's going to take a lot of time, probably more time than you think. If you're working with a press, try to set a timetable for when certain things are expected. Like if you're trying to get out the book in a certain amount of time, they may be able to tell you whether that's feasible, or when they would need, for example, the content to go to copy editing for that to be feasible. So there's going to be certain stages like copy editing where they're only going to be, a press is only going to be able to turn that around so fast. So you know, it's I think sometimes we work with authors who assume that things are going to happen much faster than they're going to, or they don't anticipate the accessibility check. We kind of mention it's coming, but they don't realize how long it's going to take to kind of just go through the whole book and make sure that everything is working as it should. Have good conversations about how long things are going to take, and don't be surprised if there are delays on your side or theirs. Implementing and communicating a clear and consistent style guide can save a lot of time on revisions, copy editing. I will just vouch, you know, Melissa and Laura's style guide was really great. You know, when we got to the copy editing phase, that was really important because a lot of their word choice decisions we passed on to the copy editor. So the copy editor didn't waste a lot of time trying to fix things that were not in accordance with the style guide they were using, but were important decisions to maintain because of the content that they were using or addressing. And then, as Rebecca has discussed, accessibility requires planning. That can go into the style guide. You know, at iOpen, we provide the authors some best practices for our platforms on accessibility to help them plan in advance. But it's something that you do have to think about a lot to make it happen successfully. And I think that is all that we have. So thank you. And we can take questions now.
Thank you so much, panelists. If anybody has any questions, feel free to put them directly into the chat. Otherwise, do you all have a recommended place where people can seek you out if they have questions afterward, after they've consumed all this information and deliberated?
Sure. I can put my email into the chat.
Wonderful. So it seems like we don't have any questions queued up. People are still thinking about it. So thank you all so much for your time and for website. And thank you so much, everybody.
It was our pleasure. Thanks for inviting us.